The most powerful army on earth had one mission: find the treasures of God and take them. They did not just loot a building. They smashed the pillars that marked the entrance to heaven. They broke apart a bronze sea that weighed more than a house. They threw the golden cups of God into soldiers' sacks like common kitchen pots. And then they burned everything that was left to the ground. By the time Nebuchadnezzar was done, the most sacred address on planet Earth was nothing but a pile of ash and rubble. But here is what makes this story different from every other conquest in history. God saw it coming. God allowed it. And God had already left the building before the first torch was thrown. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was stealing the treasures of Israel. He had no idea he was holding objects that would eventually seal the death warrant of his entire empire. This is the story of how the greatest temple ever built was destroyed in a single day. Who took God's treasures? What happened to them in Babylon? And how every single one of them found their way back home exactly as God promised. To understand the horror of what was lost, you first have to understand what had been built. In 957 BC, King Solomon did not just build a religious center. He built the single most ambitious construction project the ancient world had ever attempted. The resources consumed would equal billions of dollars in modern value. Nearly 180,000 men labored for 7 years to raise the structure. They quarried stones the size of small houses, but out of reverence for the sacred ground, 1 Kings 6-7 tells us that every stone was shaped at the quarry before it arrived. Not a single hammer, not a single chisel. No sound of construction was heard at the building site. The temple was assembled in absolute reverent silence, as if invisible hands themselves were putting it together. The main sanctuary stretched about 30 meters long and 15 meters high, but it wasn't the size that left visiting kings speechless. It was the interior. Every single centimeter of the walls, from the floor to the ceiling, was covered in hammered gold, laid over fragrant cedar wood from Lebanon. There was not a single stone visible anywhere. 10 solid gold lampstands provided the only light in the room. Their flames reflected off the golden walls until the entire chamber seemed to glow from within. Outside in the courtyard stood something even more breathtaking: the Bronze Sea. It was a massive circular basin, nearly 4.5 meters in diameter, holding around 44,000 liters of water. The basin rested on the backs of 12 carefully sculpted bronze oxen. This is where the priests washed themselves, a daily reminder that humanity cannot approach holiness without being cleansed. But all of this, the gold, the bronze, the silver that the Bible says was as common as gravel in Jerusalem, was only the outer shell. Deep inside the temple, past the golden altar and the lampstands, stood a perfect cube, 10 meters long, 10 meters wide, 10 meters high. It was called the Holy of Holies. There were no windows, no lampstands. The room existed in complete darkness, because inside that darkness was the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred chest made of acacia wood and covered in gold. Inside it were the tablets of the 10 Commandments. Let that sink in. The actual stone tablets touched by the finger of God on Mount Sinai were inside that box. Above the ark stood 2 enormous cherubim carved from olive wood and covered in gold. Their wings stretched across the room until they touched the walls on both sides. And in the 3-meter space between those wings, in the empty air above the ark, the presence of God dwelled. This was the center of the Israelite universe. For 4 centuries the people believed that as long as this building stood, as long as the ark remained hidden in the darkness, they were untouchable, until a man from the north decided that he was greater than God. The man who destroyed Jerusalem did not see himself as just a king. He saw himself as a force of nature. When Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne of Babylon in 605 BC, he didn't simply inherit a kingdom. He inherited the most lethal, efficient, and technologically advanced war machine the ancient world had ever seen. Daniel chapter 2 describes Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold on a statue representing the empires of human history. That wasn't poetry. It was a diagnosis of absolute power. His army numbered nearly 180,000 trained killers. But they did not rely on numbers alone. The Babylonians were masters of psychological terror and military engineering. They built massive mobile siege towers over 20 meters high. Imagine the psychological shock of seeing what looked like a wooden skyscraper rolling toward your city walls, packed with archers raining arrows down into your streets. They also used enormous battering rams, massive iron-headed tree trunks suspended by chains and operated by dozens of soldiers. The rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of a Babylonian ram striking a city gate could be heard for miles. Nebuchadnezzar crushed Assyria. He humiliated Egypt. He dominated the trade routes of the ancient world. Entire cities threw open their gates and surrendered the moment they saw Babylonian banners rising on the horizon. But Jerusalem was different. Jerusalem was not just a military target, it was a theological insult to Nebuchadnezzar's ego. The Israelites refused to bow to his gods. They claimed that their God, Yahweh, ruled the entire earth from a single golden room on Mount Moriah. To a man who built the legendary Hanging Gardens and demanded worship as a living deity, that claim was unbearable. Nebuchadnezzar didn't just want Jerusalem's wealth. He wanted to prove that the God of Israel was a myth. But there was a twist in this story that Nebuchadnezzar could never have imagined. Jeremiah 25 records God speaking about the Babylonian king. And God does not call him an enemy. God calls him Nebuchadnezzar, my servant. The king of Babylon believed he was conquering the world through his own ambition and genius. He had no idea he was simply a scalpel in the hand of God, being used to cut out the cancer that had infected his people. God did not destroy Jerusalem without warning. He sent prophet after prophet into the streets of the city, crying out to the kings and priests that judgment was coming. Idolatry had completely infected the nation. The very temple Solomon built for God was now surrounded by altars to the pagan gods of Solomon's foreign wives. The people were worshipping the building while ignoring the God who authorized it. Jeremiah stood in the temple courts and delivered the ultimatum: submit to Babylon and you will live. Rebel, and this city will become a graveyard. Jeremiah didn't just warn them. He wept in the streets. He begged them to listen. And they laughed. King Jehoiakim refused to believe him. He believed a lie as old as time. He thought politics could save him from prophecy. Jehoiakim secretly formed an alliance with Egypt, trusting that Pharaoh would protect him. And in a stunning act of arrogance, he simply stopped paying tribute to Babylon. The response was swift and brutal. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem. Jehoiakim died before the army even arrived, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy that he would be dragged away and buried like a donkey. His 18-year-old son Jehoiachin looked over the walls of Jerusalem, saw the endless sea of Babylonian tents stretching across the horizon, and surrendered immediately. Nebuchadnezzar showed no mercy. He deported 10,000 of Jerusalem's best and brightest to Babylon, craftsmen, soldiers, and leaders. Then he walked into the temple and stripped away the heaviest golden objects. It was a warning shot. The city was left standing, but Nebuchadnezzar installed a new king, Zedekiah, as his puppet. Zedekiah swore an oath of loyalty to Babylon. For 8 years he kept that oath. But pride is a slow poison. Under pressure from false prophets and the illusion of safety, Zedekiah made the same fatal mistake. In 588 BC, he broke his oath. He rebelled. But he didn't just break a treaty with a king. Ezekiel 17 tells us that Zedekiah had sworn his oath in the name of God. By breaking it, he made God appear like a liar in front of a pagan king. And that was the final straw. Nebuchadnezzar's patience snapped. He was finished negotiating, finished deporting. This time, he was coming to erase Jerusalem from the map. In January of 588 BC, Zedekiah stood on the walls of Jerusalem and saw the nightmare return. Only this time, Nebuchadnezzar did not bother asking for surrender. He ordered his army to build a siege wall completely surrounding the city. No one goes in, no one comes out. He was not going to waste Babylonian soldiers attacking Jerusalem's massive gates. Instead, he used a weapon that was far cheaper and far more cruel: hunger. The siege lasted 2.5 years, 900 days. Try to imagine what happens to a city trapped like that for 30 months. First, the grain reserves ran out. Then the meat disappeared. Eventually, even the water in the cisterns began to dry up. The biblical book of Lamentations, written by someone who witnessed the horror firsthand, reads like a journal from the end of the world. It records a line so disturbing the prophet could barely write it. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. That is not a metaphor. That is a mother in the city of God, in the shadow of the golden temple, doing something so unthinkable just to survive another day. This was Jerusalem, the city of God, the city of the golden temple, reduced to unimaginable depravity just to stay alive. The streets filled with corpses, the elderly collapsing in alleys, children begging for bread, and there was absolutely nothing to give them. The great deception of sin is that it makes you feel free right up until the moment the cage slams shut. Zedekiah believed rebelling against Babylon would bring independence. Instead, it brought starvation. Finally, in July of 586 BC, after 2.5 years of suffering, the Babylonian battering rams finally found a weak point. The wall cracked. The sound of stone breaking echoed through the starving city. Zedekiah tried to run, under the cover of darkness. The king, who believed he could outsmart God, attempted to escape through a gate near the king's garden. But he didn't get far. He was captured on the plains of Jericho. 2 Kings chapter 25 records the horrifying end of his reign. Nebuchadnezzar brought Zedekiah before him. First, he forced the king to watch as his own sons were executed in front of him. Then Nebuchadnezzar gave another order. Zedekiah's eyes were gouged out. The last thing the king of Jerusalem ever saw in his life was the blood of his own children, the price of his pride. He was chained in bronze shackles and dragged away to die in a Babylonian prison in total darkness. But the worst part of the story was not what happened to the king. The worst part was what happened when the Babylonians opened the doors to the room where God lived. A month after the city fell, Nebuchadnezzar sent his executioner, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard. His command was simple: dismantle the city. Nebuzaradan walked into the temple courtyard. For centuries, this ground had been restricted to ritually purified priests. No pagan soldiers carrying axes and hammers flooded the sacred space. 2 Kings chapter 25 describes the destruction of a masterpiece. The mighty bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, symbols of strength that had stood for centuries, were knocked down. Thousands of pounds of bronze crashed onto the pavement. The massive bronze sea, one of Solomon's greatest engineering achievements, was smashed apart, so the metal could be hauled away more easily. Inside the sanctuary, soldiers swept through the room collecting the golden censers, the solid gold lampstands, and the offering bowls. They stuffed them into rough sacks like ordinary war loot. Objects once dedicated to the worship of the Creator were now trophies for a pagan empire. And then they approached the veil. Behind it was the Holy of Holies, the room of absolute darkness where the high priest entered only once a year, terrified he might die if his heart was not pure. The Babylonian soldiers kicked open the doors. They raised their torches, expecting to see the most valuable object on earth. But the room was empty. The Ark of the Covenant was gone. The Bible carefully records the looting of every cup, every spoon, every basin in the temple, but it never once says the Ark was taken to Babylon. It simply disappeared. To this day, no one knows where it went. Some believe the prophet Jeremiah hid it in a cave on Mount Nebo. Others believe it was carried away and hidden in Ethiopia. But the truth may be much heavier than either theory. God never allowed his throne to become a Babylonian trophy. The ark was gone because the presence was gone. Nebuchadnezzar then gave the final command, burn it. Torches were thrown against the cedar walls. The wood that Hiram of Tyre had floated down the Mediterranean centuries earlier caught fire instantly. The heat became so intense that the gold covering the walls began to melt, running down into the cracks of the stone floor. The roof collapsed inward. Black smoke rose into the sky, a funeral pillar visible for miles. The era of Solomon was over, and when people read this story, the natural question is always the same. Where was God? How could he allow his house to burn? The prophet Ezekiel gives the chilling answer. Before the Babylonians ever arrived, Ezekiel saw a vision. He saw the glory of God rise up from between the golden cherubim. He saw it move to the doorway of the temple, and then slowly leave the city, resting on the Mount of Olives. God didn't lose a war. God isn't trapped inside a building. When the hearts of the people became completely corrupted, God packed his bags and left. Nebuchadnezzar did not burn the house of God. He burned an empty shell. For nearly 50 years, the golden vessels from Solomon's temple sat in Babylon as trophies inside the temple of the pagan god Marduk. Every Babylonian king who walked past them smiled. Proof that their empire was supreme. Proof they believed that the God of Israel was dead, but God is patient, and God's calendar does not rush for any empire. In 539 BC 40, 7 years after Jerusalem burned, the Babylonian Empire held a massive celebration. Belshazzar, the arrogant grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, threw a feast for 1,000 nobles. But wine and music were not enough for him. He wanted blasphemy. According to Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar ordered the sacred golden cups taken from Solomon's temple to be brought into the banquet hall. He, his wives, and his nobles drank wine from the holy vessels, while praising gods of gold, silver, wood, and stone. The response from heaven was immediate. Suddenly, in the brightest part of the room near the lampstand, the fingers of a human hand appeared out of thin air. The king's face turned pale. His knees began knocking together in terror. The mysterious hand wrote 4 words across the plaster wall. Mene, Main, Tekel, Parson. The elderly prophet Daniel was brought in to interpret the message. He looked directly at the terrified king and delivered the verdict of heaven. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, the unstoppable empire collapsed. Cyrus the Persian had diverted the Euphrates River and marched his army underneath the supposedly impenetrable walls of Babylon, while the city was drunk. Before the sun rose, Belshazzar was dead. Jerusalem had burned, but Babylon was erased. Then the final step of God's plan unfolded. Cyrus the Great took the throne, and his first decision regarding the Jewish people shocked the world. Ezra chapter 1 records the decree. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem. Cyrus went into the treasury of Babylon. He removed the golden cups, the silver bowls, the censers, every sacred vessel taken from Solomon's temple. He packed them up and sent them back to Jerusalem with the returning exiles. Exactly 70 years after the destruction of the temple, just as the prophet Jeremiah had predicted, every word God spoke proved true. The exiles returned home. They wept when they saw the ruins. They cleared the ashes and rebuilt the walls. Eventually, the second temple was completed. The golden vessels were placed back in their positions. The priests resumed their sacrifices. Incense once again rose toward heaven, but something was missing. When the temple was finished, no cloud of glory descended. No priests fell to the ground in awe, and when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, there was no Ark of the Covenant. The room was completely empty. Just a single stone where the golden chest once stood. For 500 years, Israel worshipped in a temple that had no visible presence of God. They waited, they prayed, they watched the sky. Why didn't God return to the building? Because God was finished living inside buildings made of stone. The temple, the gold, the sacrifices, the cherubim, they were only shadows. They were rehearsal. And God does not move backward. When the presence of God finally returned to Jerusalem 5 centuries later, he did not arrive as a cloud. He did not dwell between golden statues. He came in human flesh. Jesus Christ stood in the courtyards of that rebuilt temple and looked at the massive stones. Then he said something shocking. Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. The religious leaders thought he was speaking about architecture, but he was talking about his body. When Jesus died on the cross, the massive veil guarding the empty Holy of Holies tore in two from top to bottom, because God was officially moving out. His new address was not a building on a mountain. His new address is inside the heart of every person who believes. You are the temple of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes God allows the things we build to burn down. Our plans, our reputations, our careers, our dreams. It feels like destruction. It feels like abandonment. But sometimes the fire is not meant to destroy us. Sometimes God allows the fire so we finally realize we were worshipping the structure instead of the God who lived inside it. He will strip away everything we depend on until we understand that He is the only thing we truly need. Let me ask you a question. And answer honestly. Have you ever had something fall apart in your life? Something you thought you could never survive losing, only to realize later that God was using the fire to save you? Tell your story in the comments. And if this message bless you, please subscribe to this channel and like this video.